probably concluding chapter 3 of part 4. Judas the second is, in all the lists of the apostles, named last, and distinguished by the epithet Iscariot in Matthew 10:4, Mark 3:19, and Luke 6:16, each of whom also adds a mention of the betrayal. John says that he was the son of Simon, a common name among the Jews of that day. The name Iscariot is supposed to be a Greek form of the Hebrew Jush Kerioth. So what would that be in the actual characters? Yish Kerioth, perhaps. The man of Kerioth, a town in the limits of the tribe of Judah, of which place he is supposed to have been a native. Other derivations are suggested, but none seem so probable as this. He was the only apostle who was not a Galilean. The part which Judas came to play in the tragedy, which closed the life of Jesus, has always excited a horror which has been so intensified by oratory, poetry, and painting, that it requires some effort to examine his case with perfect freedom from all prejudice, which, however, it is necessary to do, not only for the strict historical fidelity, but in order to comprehend the relations which Jesus voluntarily, as well as those which he involuntarily sustained toward Judas. Now, they were still editing the Bible, so all these canonical Gospels actually went through changes after this Gospel of Judas that they found, was written. So, we have no reason to suppose that his childhood and youth were marked with any more prognostications of a bad manhood than those of Peter and John. Indeed, he was not so much exposed to the danger of contracting vicious habits as those youngsters in a small fishing town. His subsequent defection flings its shadow back, but it is to be remembered that crimes have been committed in his maturer years by many a man who, if he had died young, would have been canonized because his youth had been so saintly. The foolish stories of the apocryphal New Testament are mere fantasies. Well, some of them are a lot more historical than whatever, and why did they feel like they didn't have to change them so much compared to the other biblical writings that did make it, right? The first intimation of him is in the gospel histories, is that he had messianic hopes, was looking for the deliverance of Israel with probable secular aspirations, but not more worldly than those which animated the sons of Jonas and Zebedee and thousands of other ardent young Hebrews. It is possible that he was among the disciples of John and had been led by his dedication to follow Jesus as the leader of the great national hopes. There is this much certainty that nothing had appeared in his conduct to arouse any suspicion in the minds of his brother apostles. There was no prejudice against him. On the contrary, he was a trusted man among them and was made the treasurer of the exchequer, which contained their own slender means, and whatever was contributed from time to time to be dispersed by their charity to the poor. This post of trust and honor he held to the very last, and no one seems to have suspected any baseness, and Jesus chose to add him to the number of those who should lay the foundation of his kingdom in the hearts of men. And yet he betrayed the great and good friend. The selection of Judas as one of his apostles is to historians perhaps the most puzzling of all the movements of Jesus. The act which is specially pressed by unfriendly critics, but perhaps it is not wholly inexplicable, even upon critical grounds. Judas was a powerful man. He had prodigious passions, and he had enormous self-control. When Jesus, as a warning to the other disciples, dissected the character of Judas, running the scalpel around his heart, this wonderful man had such iron nerve and muscle and blood that by neither twitch nor pallor did he allow his colleagues to see that Jesus was dissecting him. He had great financial skill, and men of thought have always had a kind of awe for the man who can make money. Now, of course, he wasn't literally using a scalpel, but merchant princes are greater wonders and objects of homage to the scholar than the profound and scholarly philosophers are to the wealthy tradesman. The disciples admired this in Judas and probably expected that the kingdom should be set up. Their friend Judas would be made chancellor of the exchequer. Judas had undoubtedly professed great attachment to Jesus, and must have felt upon his rugged nature the sweet influences of such a character. He was also among the expectants of the Messiah. The other disciples kept him in their circle as Jesus winnowed and winnowed, and the chaff flew away, such as loved father or mother more than Jesus, such as must bury their dead before they could follow Jesus, such as must be as secure of a bed at least as the foxes and the birds. As those who could not endure the tests of this new discipleship dropped back, strange as it may seem, it is, nevertheless, the historical fact that for some motive Judas clung to Jesus. The motive may have been very base. We all now agree in believing that at least some baseness was in the motive. But the disciples did not detect what may have been very apparent to their sagacious master. When he came to say which 12 of all the disciples had exhibited the greatest devotion to his causes and his person, it was manifest to the whole crowd that after the other 11 had been named, no one else stood in the company who had any claims upon Jesus and upon his nearest friends, which could compete with those of Judas Iscariot. Now, if Judas had not been selected, who should have been the 12th? The disciples trusted him. He had the purse of the company. He was as well behaved as any, probably much more polished than the rude Galilean fishermen about him. He had followed Jesus as closely. He had been as useful as the others. Why should he not be chosen? Some reason would have been demanded by the 11 at least. He could mar, we know. Such men, it is usually believed, can make. He had probably painted the glories of the coming messianic reign very brilliantly to the imagination of his co-disciples. Why should he not continue of them? They had selected him as the treasurer. These 12 had been coming into closer communion every day for many months. Why should Jesus reject one of the friends? Jesus knew what was in man, what was in Judas. If he rejected Judas, that man of powerful passions might have thwarted the designs, disordered the discipleship, and precipitated the destiny of Jesus. If, added to the number of the apostles, Judas could be kept under the eye and under a magnetism of the presence of Jesus, so that if he had a devil, as Jesus declared, and if he should betray his master, as Jesus predicted, that evil might be postponed until the seed of the kingdom should be so planted as no longer to need the personal presence of Jesus, but be vigorous and well-grown enough to need only his spiritual fostering for its growth to maturity. On this account, it were well to retain Judas. And then it is not to be forgotten that no historical personage displays so much lovingness as Jesus of Nazareth. His power over the world today lies not so much in his position in history, not in his superior brain, not in any special thing he has done, nor in the remarkable thoughts he has uttered, as in the transcendent lovingness which intensifies and transfigures and glorifies all his deeds and all his words. Devilish as might have been the character of Judas, why might it not have been right to afford him all the sweet influences which reside in the tender communings of a noble brotherhood, whose spiritual father was such a soul as Jesus? He could not but betray Jesus at the last. Let Jesus do nothing to hasten catastrophes. His life is to be too grand, and his influence over the ages too powerful to make him afraid lest some critic of subsequent times should suggest that in one case, at least, he committed a blunder. It was no blunder. It was a sublime adventure of love. As in the case of the other apostles, we shall see the trace of the history and examine the motives of Judas Iscariot more minutely in connection with that of his master. For the present, we are merely taking a view of the general characteristics of those whom Jesus first admitted to his intimacy and subsequently appointed his lieutenants. That this was a special setting apart to a special work seems quite apparent from that very face of the history. Up to this date, these men had mingled with the crowd of disciples and bore no signs of separation from their brethren, except as they closed up in more solid friendship for each other and for Jesus. The language of the historian shows that they were now regarded as charged with the mission peculiar and responsible. The whole body received a name. Never before, but almost always after this election, they are called the 12, oi dodeca, to distinguish them from the other disciples. Never before, but by Jesus at their election, and by their brethren afterwards, they were called apostles. Luke 6:13. It is noticed that not before, but after this event, the name Peter is constantly applied to Simon, the son of Jonas, as his master had conferred this name upon him at his selection. See Mark 3:16 and Luke 6:14. There seems to be an exception in Luke 5:8, but there the name Peter is merely added to that of Simon, and this addition is supposed to be a marginal note, which has crept into the text. Again, Matthew introduces the name Peter with that of Simon before the ordination, but he couples both names, as in chapter 4:18, and after the ordination uses only the name Peter. See Greswell 26. According to a well-known Oriental custom, this custom still prevails in the East. Chrysostom notices that masters, upon purchasing slaves, frequently change their names as a sign of the right acquired over them. Now, in the Islamic vision, you're not allowed to change the names of slaves, and you don't take part in the trade of capturing slaves. You don't go to war just to capture slaves, and so you don't buy from this other group that, oh, well, we fight people and take prisoners and you buy from us. No. And Jeffrey Epstein basically built his island as the sign of the slave trade. If I had known about that, I would have known what was going on, and I would have known about the mistress thing, and I would have known it was a prostitution den, and perhaps they had an abortion doctor on call and stuff like this. I would have known that by seeing what was going on there, but that's a whole another thing. But the number of the apostles deserves some consideration. Although many very foolish and fanciful things have been written in regard to the symbolism of numbers, no careful student of the ancient records can fail to see that some meaning was among all nations, and not the least among the Hebrews, assigned to special numbers. The style of the building indicated that it was a place to get the elite slaves, the ones specially trained to serve. And there were features that could be, but this is not place to go into that. Thus, 1 symbolizes unity, 2 antithesis, 3 synthesis and the divinity, 4 humanity or the world, as we are reminded of the 4 corners of the earth and the 4 elements, as anciently supposed, of the 4 seasons and the 4 points of the compass. 7, the sum of 3 and 4. The relation of God to the world. 10, completeness. 12, the product of 3 and 4. God's indwelling in the world. And we call to mind the 12 patriarchs and the 12 tribes and the 12 foundations and the 12 gates of the heavenly Jerusalem. Now, when I do number symbolism videos, let's be well aware that there is a lot of variety of meaning that can be attached to some of these things, but Baher in his Symbolique 1, page 175 says, 10, by virtue of the general laws of thought, shuts up the series of primary numbers and includes all in itself. The first decade, and of course also the number 10, is the representative of the whole numerical system, so that 10 is the natural symbol of perfection and completeness. This view is adopted by Dr. Fairbairn, Typology of Scripture, I think, volume 2, page 88, who connects it with the 10 plagues of Egypt, the 10 commandments, and the tithes. Remember, the tarot deck, typically, 9 is what you gain, 10 is, the wealth as a whole. Again, reflecting that whole tithing thing, right? That Jesus had the 12 tribes in his mind in fixing the number of his apostles is evident. When Peter asked him what should be the reward of those who forsook all and followed him, Jesus said that they should sit upon 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Their original mission, we shall see, was to the 12 tribes. Matthew 19:28. Now, the national or even more local prophets, certainly, they had their mission in that realm, but certainly the influence was, benefited people otherwise. But the original mission, their mode of appointment must have had in it something that solemnly designated them, whether a mere call to step forward from the crowd, or in addition thereto the imposition of hands, something that put them apart from the promiscuous crowd of disciples, and there must have been some order in which they were called. In the enumeration above, I have followed the catalogue as recited by Matthew, except that I have put his name before that of Thomas, as Mark and Luke do. His modesty seems to have led him to make this transposition, thus yielding to Thomas what the other historians do not give, a precedence over himself. His modesty is further seen in adding to his own name the reproachful designation a publican, which Mark and Luke considerately omit. This is the view taken of the circumstances by Eusebius, Deems, Evangel 3:5. That the reader may have before his eye the slight variations in the role of apostles, deputies is probably a better way to understand that, but he will find in a note the order given by Matthew, Mark, and Luke severally. The precise order in which they were called may not be a matter of vital importance. Well, it would indicate what perhaps their sources, that they weren't firsthand witnesses, that there's something of meaning, right? But as the selection shows something of the mind of Jesus, it is interesting to know whose name fell first from his lips, who's next, and next to the very close of the calling. Now, if the name is totally agreed or whatnot, maybe it's, maybe the order is just, not the important thing to learn. Matthew's order Simon 1, surnamed Peter, Andrew, James 1, John, Philip, Nathanael, surnamed Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James 2, Judas 1, Lebbaeus, or Thaddaeus, Luke's, Simon 1, Andrew, James 1, John, Philip, Nathanael, Matthew, Thomas, James 2, Simon 2. Mark, Simon 1, James 1, John, Andrew, Philip, Nathanael, Matthew, Thomas, James 2, Judas 1. So the last two of each list, Matthew's order, Simon 2, Judas 2, Iscariot. Luke's order, Judas 1, Judas 2. Mark's order, Simon 2, Judas 2. In these men, some writers have seen fundamental types of certain qualifications needed for the propagation of Christianity. Thus, Peter represents confession, Andrew, the manly pioneer, missionary zeal, James 1, the son of thunder, martyrdom, John, the beloved disciple, mysticism and depth and calmness, Philip, communion, come and see, Nathanael, sincerity, simplicity, devoutness, Matthew, ecclesiastical learning, Thomas, inquiry and sacred criticism, James 2, union and ecclesiastical government, Judas 1, Lebbaeus, pastoral faithfulness, discipline, Simon 2, pastoral activity, and Judas 2, Iscariot, church property. And laying on Matthew 10. And see, they were writing a gospel. So, this apocryphal sort of literature has. But anyways, we perceived that they all agree as to the relative places of the apostles. It's interesting, John is one of the ones that has the list, of course, but John was first and the other ones were the same generation, you could say, because the 20s, 30s, 40s, and the one written in the 50s, so, and then the Didache was written the next generation. But anyways, we perceive that they all agree as to the relative places of 5 of the apostles, making Peter first, Philip 5th, Nathanael 6th, James 2nd, 9th, and Judas Iscariot 12th. Matthew and Luke make Andrew 2nd, James 1st, 3rd, and John 4th. James 1, 3rd. Luke and Mark make Matthew 7th, and Thomas 8th. Matthew and Mark make Judas 1 as the 10th, and Simon 2nd as the 11th. It will be seen that Matthew and Luke agree throughout, except where modesty led Matthew into putting himself last in the second class, and in the relative position of Judas the first. John twice speaks of himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, 13:23 and 22. And if he says pseudepigraphal or focused on a particular person and they put the name later, which actually isn't as supported as people think it is, it's just not the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that people think, right? 22. A fact which other historians did not think important enough to mention. Well, that's not exactly the thing. It's just not for a particular place. And there was a lot of adding and subtracting in the Bible. There was in the Greek New Testament, we have 10,000 variants in the Greek. And then we moved to the Latin, which didn't have as much variance, but there's a lot of differences, even in the books that are listed as accepted. But who could help adverting to the most beautiful fact of his own life, or make memorable a love so exalted and so distinguishing? It may have been vanity, but it was a sweet and lovely and loving vanity, which is not offensive to God, as ought to be pardonable to man. Okay, but these seem to be rather fanciful. Gentlemen who have been missionary secretaries and treasurers and heads of church publishing houses would scarcely consent to recognize Judas Iscariot as their representative in the Apostolic College. Calm and unprejudiced historians would say that while on the one side of their lives these characteristics were manifested, quite as conspicuously on the other side were other things exhibited, and so Peter might just as well represent falsehood and cowardice, James, bigotry and ill-temper, John, vanity and ferocity, Thomas, blind infidelity, Matthew, venality and baseness, Simon II, intolerance and ritualism, Judas Iscariot, corruption and treachery, and all the rest of the disciples want a character. Oh, come on, finish the list. The fact is that when they were called to be special messengers and ambassadors from Jesus to the nations, they were not such men as ordinary prudence would select. There was not one that would compare with Saul of Tarsus, who afterward took the whole molding of their infant society. They were all from the middle ranks. They were not learned in the schools, and seemed wholly unfitted to cope with the scholarship and measure arms with the philosophy of the times. They had no money, nor rich connections, nor political associations or influence. They were, as compared with refined society, ill-bred, stupid, incredulous. If the purpose had been a political revolution, there was not a man among them who could compare with the Swiss Tell, or perhaps even the Neapolitan Masaniello. If they were to overcome Jewish prejudice and silence the rabbis, there was no one amongst them who could talk except Peter, and he was always so uncertain that no reliance could be placed upon him. So why is he the head of the church and all that stuff? Right? In advance, one could not tell whether he would brag or lie or run. There were probably only two who knew anything of the Greek tongue, namely Peter and Philip. So that could tell you that only Gospels or whatever and those names would possibly be of the group, right? If the nations were to be speedily moved by Christianity, it must, as men would reason, be done through the Roman power, our Greek civilization. But these men were all laymen, and had neither political influence nor intellectual culture. They had no standing even among their own people, and certainly no influences with their conquerors and civil rulers. Peter and Andrew were brothers. So were James 1 and John, and friends of Peter and Andrew. So were James 2 and Judas 1. 4 of them had been disciples of the ascetic John the Baptist. All of them except Judas Iscariot were of the most uncouth part of the Jewish population. They were Galileans, and several of them fishermen. They spoke their vernacular brokenly, as if a man should select a dozen Negroes of average character from the plantations of the southern states of America and set them on the work of revolutionizing the philosophy of all schools and the elements of all civilization and the systems of all religion. It is to be noticed that they did not choose him, he chose them. This he tells them, John 15, verse 16. This is true of their public work. They had gathered about him and clung together through personal love of him, but they had not settled it in their minds precisely what he was, and the regard for him was largely mingled with an expectation of future secular good and glory. If their general expectation should prove correct, what shall we have, therefore, was the question of Peter, who, with all his faults, was certainly not the most selfish among the disciples. Matthew 19:27. It is to be specially noticed that there is nothing of the modern church idea in anything done by Jesus on this or any other occasion. The word translated church occurs only twice in the histories of Jesus, namely Matthew 16:18 and Matthew 1817, neither of which, it seems to me, can impartial criticism find anything like the modern close corporation idea. They will be examined in their places. Well, it's the word not even church, but ecclesia, a gathering, a political gathering, you could say. Not politics in the modern sense, but political gathering is not just the immediate family. These men, it's certainly not church in the sense of hero shrine, from the word kirk, These men were not induced into any priestly office or given preeminence over their brethren. They were distinguished, discriminated, set apart for a special work, but not clothed with corporate powers. There was no baptism or any other rite indicative of an entrance upon church membership. Jesus did not baptize. His disciples had done so, but they had taken the idea from John the Baptist to baptize those who were already in the church, and whose baptism was to indicate the Messiah. If an outward formal sign did no good, it did no hurt, and Jesus had allowed it, but he had established no sacrament. These men had no creed. Well, or it was just superfluous to mention it because they take baths to show up to, before coming to the weekly service or something. It's like, well, that was standard, There was no creed. They loved Jesus. They hoped great things from Jesus. He did establish beliefs, and the credo per se was lost to history, the exact form of it, right? He loved them and intended to instruct them and leave with them the gospel of the kingdom. What he seems to have seen in them, and what was the basis of their call, was the religiousness of their general character. Whatever culture they lacked, and whatever faults they had devoutness, the capability of giving themselves finally and fully up to an idea. They had some certain noticeable genius for religion. Them he selected to instruct, but he gave them no esoteric culture, told them nothing about himself which he did not tell the multitude, imparted nothing which should in any manner give them any title to rule others who believed on him. Luke 6:13 says that he named them apostles, and Mark 3:14 and 15 says that he ordained 12, and they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach and have power to heal sickness and to cast out devils. But Matthew 7:21 to 23 indicates that you do not do good deeds in Jesus' name. And you're working outside his law and not the sort of people that he would know, right? To be wholly given to the work of teaching the truth and doing good to the bodies and souls of men was the work of these men sent of Jesus, and therefore called apostles. Some organization naturally took place after the death of Jesus, keeping together those who loved him. But that they were to be considered a close corporation, keeping all of Christianity, all the beautiful and precious legacy of Jesus to themselves, with the powers to transmit the future generations of successors by Messina descent, never seemed to have entered into the mind of Jesus or any of the 12. Ancient lampstand. And so one of the things about a lampstand like that is there is some deliberateness of the form. Sure, it uses less material to give it 3 legs versus 4, but then if you're carving this out of one piece, it would be easier to have 4. So there's some symbolic connection to that, right? And it's not always dividing divinity into different personages or different beings or whatever form of polytheism one's thinking, right? 1, 2, 3 sections, and then you have a base, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, perhaps. I don't know. It could be representative of the human in some different way, right?